We often forget what originally led to the partition of India, and what caused it remains a vague memory amidst the sea of hate and bipolar malevolence, with a dash of communal violence evident even to this day. Although we have seen the rise of communal riots and a stark Muslim and Hindu hate fester throughout the 20th century, this is again something caused not by religion alone, but the division on the basis of it that brings in strife and hatred. Since the reasons for this are complex and hard to compress into a single video, this video will primarily talk about the partition, not in its entirety. Of course, it will be divided into several parts, and but instead give a glimpse into what partition was and what its impact was on the millions of people who faced history's worst humanitarian crisis yet. If we were to calculate all the people living in India to this day that have any vague form of memory about what the partition was like, the numbers are conspicuously dwindling as the time goes by. The time we reach 2030, there will only be a few hundred thousand remaining that can give an account of the events that have unfolded in 1947. The partition can be seen through the narratives of millions of different people, and although I won't really go in depth on all of them, I'll just give you a basis so that we can further diverge and talk more about these accounts that followed after the partition. In the book Inglorious Empires by Shashi Tharoor, the front prelude talks of how the partition remains to be an active memory to people even to this day. Albeit it's been 8 years since the book was released, and the number he threw back then was around 6 million people that have crossed the age of 80 and around. We can still very much assume that people living well over the age of 80 plus today still have an idea of the events that or the partition in their memory. Not only that, but it won't be all that absurd to think that people living well past the days of partition too can hold accounts of how it was like, from how their friends or how their close relatives have accounted or how have talked about how the partition took place. So this very much is something that is still fresh in the Indian psyche, and then this is in some. It's barely been a century since it happened. So clearly, it's really we can still understand its effects even to this day, and we must take great care in understanding it as well as spreading the right information about it too. We can start this all off in the 1940s, but I know it's not really the best time to start it, because clearly there is much more in-depth explanations of it. But either way, I would like to start in the early 1940s, for example. We can start off in the early 1940s. World War II was still at its apogee, and the British were desperate to recruit and take in more Indian soldiers to fight for the British cause. So Stanford Cripps devises a plan that comes to be known as a Cripps offer, an offer which would be regarded with contempt by the Congress members and outright rejected by them. The plan was simple: India must actively take part in the war effort, and in turn will be given independence, more or less dominion status, by the British government, something that they have highly sought for ever since the Home Rule movement. The desire to partake in the war in turn for independence, or at the very least more suzerainty over the land, was seen with ambivalence and oftentimes confusion. I would make an entire video on India's role in the war and how influential it was in supporting the British war, but for now all you need to know was that both the Congress as well as the Muslim League had completely opposing views on how to treat the war and what its outcomes later would turn out to be. Gandhi would later go on to launch the Quit India movement in 1942, the final blow towards British rule in India. Slogans of Quit India reigned as Gandhi demanded the British to go ahead and quit India for good. It was also around 1943 we see a shift in power as Lord Linthinglaw transferred the power to Viceroy to the power of Viceroy to Lord Wavell, who was now in charge of the Bengal famine taking place in the province of Bengal, which will later go on to kill millions of Bengali citizens due to starvation and intentional redirection of goods and supplies by Churchill and his government. The conquest of Burma by the Imperial Japanese Army could also explain the lack of food supplies, as they weren't provided to the starving people of Bengal. But to say that the famine was a completely inevitable thing would be absolutely absurd, as the administration responsible for quelling the famine did a very poor job in doing so. When it came to the actual use of violence in the early 1940s by Indians, it was actually quite low, below expected danger levels, I might add. Aside from the naval mutiny of 1946, where naval officers mutinied against their officers due to inhumane treatment and demanded unilateral independence for India, or the use of Indian POWs by Subhash Chandra Bose in the creation of Azad Hind, a military force that thought of ousting British control over India and siding with the Axis powers of Japan. In the 1940s, as well as the late half of the 1930s, could be described as a time of rumination and action shared rambunctiously between the INC and the Muslim League. The council elections of 1937, for example, saw the creation of coalitions in the provinces of India where both parties were required to share power. This had, however, turned out to be a conspicuous blow to the Muslim League, as INC absorptive tendencies show the League's distrust towards the INC, and the fight over the share between the majority Hindu population and the minority Muslims began. Quite obviously, the desire for Muslim autonomy was a huge want for the Muslim League ever since the days of the Shimla deputation in 1906, where groups of delegates led by Aga Khan, representing the Muslim population, decided to negotiate with Lord Binto to create separate electorates for their community. The government complied, and thus the creation of the Minto Murli reforms began. Following the transformative changes seen here, the British government had been chipping away more and more power from their hands to the Indians. Instead, the autonomy was given to the local legislative governments as well as running frequent elections in the provinces, although the voters were quite limited, numbering around 5 million only. Some of the prerequisites included you having a college degree or in some form some extra credentials that would make you viable to vote in the elections, thereby limiting the amount of voters. The cooperation shared between the two parties was deteriorating over a period of time, as it is quite evident between the differing interests. The Indian National Congress stood on the basis of liberalism and secularism. Everyone part of the INC, whether Muslim, Parsi or Hindu, was considered in a broader term of Indian. Meanwhile, we see the Muslim League stand for the interests of Muslims and their interests and whatever favored them first. The wider term of Muslims couldn't be further simplified, however. The division seen in the Muslim community too can be quite visible, as it consists of communities such as the Rohingyas, Pathans, a mix of Arab and Turkic admixture, as well as a mixture of Sunni and Shiite Muslims. So clearly, the Muslim community too was divided. When it comes to understanding the wider cause and the wider interests that Muslims shared, we have to first go back a few decades ago, before independence was actually made. The wider cause for Muslim unity and promulgating their interests was cloaked by the rise of Western ideas. People such as Syed Ahmad Khan, a well-known figure, spread the notions of economic betterment and upliftment for several Muslim communities that otherwise lived in an impecunious state. He would later on receive knighthood from the British Raj in the year 1888 and established the Aligarh College in the year 1875, which served to better educate the younger Muslim populace as well. The notion Syed wanted to spread was the cooperation between the British rulers and the Muslims that could further lead to further upliftment for the Muslims. He was in many ways the first Muslim reformer in terms of that. The philosophy of Syed Ahmad Khan and the creation of a Goldilocks condition for Western ideas and scientific thought, as well as a spread of Quranic studies, coupled with this detest of orthodox isolationist Muslims who later paved the way for the creation of the Khilafat community, for example, by creating a sort of link between Western liberalism and safeguarding the interests of the Muslims. The dynamic entry and the larger vision of Pakistan as a nation and country would be considered to have been laid as a sacrosanct by the famous Hindu philosopher Muhammad Iqbal. Iqbal, like many other intellectuals at the time, wanted to find a condition that would safeguard the interests of the Muslim populace that numbered in the millions in India and consisted of about a quarter of the population at the time. He famously wrote in Persian and was in many regards considered as a niche in an Islamic setting. The ideas of Pakistan and a state was an extremely new concept, barely predating a century back, to be specific. The notion of a state for Muslims, however, wasn't. Iqbal famously suggested that the creation of Pakistan that consisted of parts of Sindh, Punjab, Balochistan, and NWFP, the Northwest Frontier Provinces. It's an abbreviation of that. And thus the very foundations of Pakistan were set. Then a few Cambridge young Muslims would go on to coin the term Pakistan. In the very crust of Iqbal's philosophy laid a huge connection of Western and Oriental ideas. His philosophy, however, would sought to bring more autonomy to the Muslims as well as reduce communal violence and vitriol between the communities. Iqbal would also go about and foster a strong relationship with the next Vienna Jew, Muhammad Asad. Muhammad Asad will later have a close relationship with the very father of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud. Tensions, however, soared between them as Muhammad Asad viewed Wahhabism, an extreme sect of Islam that views the Quranic text in almost absolute light as being too extreme. Assad and Iqbal both believed in the Pakistan that did not adhere to common descent, but instead a common goal, a government that is formed regardless of caste, culture, or economic nationalism, but instead a shared religion and thereby a shared goal. Rather than go further about Muhammad Iqbal's main ideology and the future of Pakistan, I am no means trained to do so in any exquisite detail. I am sure that the very notion of Muslim unity and further improvement of the Muslim community could be seen in the early 1920s and 1930s and the eventual creation of Pakistan as a state. Now that we talked to the very sacrosanct and the very base of a Pakistan state, what it was thought to have originally stood for. Let's get back to the early 40s and the post World War II scenario. In the book The Last 1,000 Days of the British Empire by Peter Clarke, the historian suggests that the Britishers were after the war was over in a terrible economic debt, following the reverse Lend-Lease as well as the Lend-Lease policies followed by the British government, where money was siphoned from the US to British hands in order to increase the war effort. The Quebec Conference between the powers of USA, Canada, and Britain further sealed negotiations in accordance to what had happened in the Quebec Conference. The overall state of the British Empire after World War II was quite evidently adverse to the colonial interests. The days of the British Raj were in many ways numbered down to the days of, to the date by the time Allies declared victory over Japan on the 2nd of September, and thus the quest to probably meet the needs of the Indian subcontinent. Not only that, but the new shift in government made Clement Attlee now in charge of the charge of Britain, as well as the entire process of decolonization of India, including the partition, was put into his hands and into his responsibility. The maintenance as well as the prevention of violence in provinces was of top priority. Aside from safely expatriating most of the remaining British officers and residents of the subcontinent, which, by the way, numbered only in a few thousands, it was around 50,000 to be specific, governors of different provinces aimed to maintain law and order by employing various police forces to quell any uprisings as well as violence between both of the communities. Banditry, communism, terrorist attacks, all had to be stopped one way or the other. The various groups, right-leaning ones to be specific, that instigated violence could include the Muslim National Guard, the Rashtriya the RSS, for example, a Hindu nationalist group, and the Sikh affiliated militias like the Akali Dal and associated paramilitaries such as the Jhatas. These so-called volunteer organizations, many of which were formed in the late 1930s and the early 1940s, were considered by the British to be Indian private armies, quote unquote. They were all seen by the British as instigators of violence, but in the early months of 1945 to 1946, not rising as threats to British rule or British citizens still the ultimate rubric of concern. Not only that, but by around 1946 we see a huge and absolutely atrocious communal riots take place in Calcutta, the place that now comes to be known as Noakhali. Now that we've set the stage for what is happening in the post-war period, which was obviously a precarious period to begin in, we'll get into the political mishaps that took place as well. The British Raj at the time had one goal in mind, and that was to properly and safely transfer power from the hands of the British to the natives. The gradual erosion of power from the British hands was, however, not without spilled blood. When we look at the years 1944 to 1945, both the Britishers as well as the Indians attempted to make several institutional prophecies that would either way support the two-nation theory or in another form oppose it. In the year 1944, for example, Lord Wavell proposed a plan that came to be known as the Wavell Plan. It mainly aimed to change the Governor-General's Executive Council as well as bring in the interim government. In doing so, came about the Shimla Conference of 1945, where deputies from both the INC as well as the Muslim League met with each other to come up with a wider consensus. The Wavell Plan in the end, however, failed to meet the expectations of the Muslim League as well. Failed to meet the expectations of the Muslim League as they proposed a two-nation theory as proposed and aforementioned before. Following all of that and coupled with the inevitable transfer of power from the British hands to the natives, there comes to be another apprehensive question to deal with. How? How do you transfer the power to the natives at this point? It becomes inexorably true that all that remained now was the how and not the why of transferring power in this almost inchoate post-colonial world. Clement Attlee, the new PM of Britain, decided to devise a plan that came to be known as the Cabinet Mission Plan. Originally arrived on the March 24, 1946, Clement Attlee sent Patrick Lawrence, the Secretary of the State of India, Stanford Cripps, President of the Board of Trade, and A.V. Alexander, the First Lord of the Admiralty. And although the main goals of the Cabinet Mission Plan will be too much to talk about for this video, the only thing you should make clear should be the fact that the plan was against the notion of a two-nation theory proposed by Jinnah, and it brought the division of provincial assemblies into three kinds, with each of them having, the three kinds were A, B, and C, and each of them having their own executive and legislative assembly. And later on, they would go forth and join together to form a union government of some sort. All the three sections of the government, A, B, and C, would join together and form the Union Assembly. This in many ways was a temporary government formed and formulated by the British Raj. The Cabinet Mission Plan was vied in several paradigms by both of the parties. The reason why it stayed two parties was the INC and the Muslim League were basically the only two parties allowed to run in the provincial elections, thereby creating a sort of bi-party dominance across the subcontinent. They were the two most dominant parties present at the time. The Cabinet Mission Plan would later be accepted by the Muslim League but reprimanded by the INC, seeing it as a failed attempt by the imperial government to divide power and thereby failing to create a unified central state. Lord Wavell, however, managed to squeeze the INC into the interim government, which was at that point an overextension of the previous government. The interim government, however, was a government that was primarily dominated by the Congress members, with a few members from the Muslim League, including Liaquat Ali and Ibrahim Islam Chundrigar. Nehru served as vice president and the head executive of the interim government. Now that we got all that clear, we can finally get to the part where the partition actually takes place. I've set up the proper background in order to explain what led to it. Now let's get back and let's go back to the partition. A deadline of June 30th, 1948 was fixed for the transfer of power, even if the Indian politicians had not agreed by the time of the Constitution. Not only that, but Lord Mountbatten, yes, the one who, the Viceroy of Burma, the one who played a huge role in the Kohima War, would later on be the last Viceroy of the British Raj, after following and succeeding Lord Wavell, who had to resign. Lord Mountbatten could be explained as a person who tried his best to at least unify what is left of the British Raj, as Jinnah at that point was too phlegmatic about even thinking about the creation of a unified India and instead wanted a complete separate state for the Muslims. And thus we have the Mountbatten Plan, an attempt by Lord Mountbatten to properly transfer power on the basis of dominion status. A basis of a dominion status given to the Indian government. The plan is quite simple, in fact. It sought to hold petitions and referendums across the area of Sindh and the NWFP, as well as the region of Bengal. These referendums would later decide the fate of these regions, as it was that part that as it was that decided whether they should belong to the newly formed state of Pakistan or India. The case of Hyderabad, for example, is actually quite interesting when it came to this prospect. Although it was indeed a Muslim-dominated state for centuries under the Nizam of Hyderabad, it would later be invaded by Indian forces under the code name of Operation Polo. I will talk about that later, but not in this video, of course. Now the main question as to why it was the dominion status that the Indians preferred. Why would India prefer to have dominion status over Purna Swaraj? Purna Swaraj was actually made in near the river Ravi in January 26, 1929, which called for absolute independence, as the name suggests. Well, this can be explained. The one fine explanation for it can be the desire for the INC to have a smooth transfer of power rather than a tumultuous one, and create a strong state rather than a precarious one. I might add, the date for unilateral independence for India was set on the 15th of August 1947 by Lord Mountbatten. A partition committee was also set up by the government, by the interim government as well. So, on the July the 5th, 1947, the British Parliament passed the Indian Independence Act, which is based on the Mountbatten Plan, and the Act got royal assent on June 18th, 1947. The Act was finally implemented on the August of 15th, 1947. The Act provided for the creation of two independent dominions of India and Pakistan, with effect from August 15, 1947. Each dominion, India and Pakistan, was to have a Governor General to be responsible for the effective operation of the Act. The Constituent Assembly for each new dominion was to exercise the power of the legislator of the dominion. The existing Central Legislative Assembly and the Council of States were to be automatically dissolved for the transitional period, i.e., till a new constitution was adopted by each dominion. The governments of the two dominions were to be carried on in accordance with the Government of India Act of 1935. As per the provisions of the Indian Independence Act of 1947, Pakistan became independent on August 14th, while India got its freedom on August 15th, 1947. Muhammad Ali Jinnah became the first Governor General of Pakistan. India, however, decided to request Lord Mountbatten to continue as the Governor General of India. So now that we set the stage for a partition, I will later on go to explain the after effects of it, how partition actually took place, how the mass migrations in the humanitarian crisis unfolded after the partition. So I would like to thank you for bearing through this entire video. I know it's quite long, but when it comes to topics like this, it requires thorough understanding of the context as well as research as well. There will always be a part 2 that centers around the after effects of the partition and a much more deeper dive into communal rights, as well as how the transfer of power when it came to administrational power took place in a much more nuanced sense. Thank you for watching. I'll hopefully see you next time, I guess. Thank you.